World's Best School Psychologist by Creepy Carbs, featuring the voice of Dr. Creepin Van Pasta.
When I was 12, I came to the conclusion that everyone in the world, including my own family, was against me. I was never a problem child, but my parents sure treated me like one. For example, I used to need to be home by 5 p.m. every day. This clearly restricted my amount of playtime outdoors. I wasn't allowed to have friends over to play at the house, nor was I allowed to go over to anyone else's. I had to finish homework directly after I came home from school, no matter how long it took. My parents refused to buy me video games and forced me to read books, and then write a book report on them to prove I actually read it. Now, even those rules I just listed were quite frustrating to me as a child, but they aren't what upset me most. What really hurt me was the lack of compassion on behalf of my parents. My mother was a bitter woman who always made me feel guilty about accidents or mistakes I'd made. My father only knew one emotion: frustration. The only time he spoke to me was when he screamed at me for receiving poor test scores or beat me for misbehaving. But enough about them. Let's talk about my school psychologist. For his own privacy, we'll call him Dr. Tanner. Like most junior high schools, a psychologist is always available on campus during school hours to assist any students in need of counseling, whether it be emotional, academic, social, behavioral, or whatever. To be honest, I'd never seen any students talking with Dr. Tanner. Every day, I would walk past his office on my way to the cafeteria and peek through his door's little window. He would always be in there, alone, working on some paperwork. I guess that most kids were too afraid to speak about their problems to an adult who was practically a stranger. For this reason, it took me 3 weeks to muster enough courage to go into his office. March the 2nd, 1993, was the day I decided to voice my troubles to Dr. Tanner. During lunch break, I stood in front of his office door and knocked. Through the window, I could see him raise his head, smile, and motion for me to come in. I did. He greeted me by introducing himself and asking for my name. Dr. Tanner was a very soft-spoken man who seemed to radiate kindness. In less than 30 minutes, I rambled to Dr. Tanner about how mean my parents were to me and how they didn't care about me at all. After a while, my voice began to quiver, and I stopped speaking. The psychologist listened patiently to my whole spiel, arms folded and head nodding. I half expected him to begin talking about how everything I just said was untrue, and that my parents loved me dearly, and blah, blah, blah. But he didn't. Dr. Tanner leaned towards me with a grin on his face and said, "You know, I'm the best school psychologist in the world. I promise we will fix this." I rolled my eyes. "Okay, but how?" I asked. "I have my ways," he replied. "I'm a man of my word. I promise that within just 1 month, the relationship between you and your parents will change for the better. Forever. After a brief pause, he continued, although I do need you to make me a promise. You have to promise me that you'll come back to my office after school tomorrow, and that you won't tell anyone that we had this conversation today. It'll be our little secret. I promised. The following day, I returned to Dr. Tanner after school. It was around 4 p.m. when I entered his office. After a warm welcome, he asked me to have a seat in front of his desk once again. Upon sitting down, I watched Dr. Tanner close the blinds of the door's tiny window. There, he smiled. Now we have all the privacy we need. We began to talk about my likes and interests, my favourite subjects in school, my least favourite teachers, and things of the like. About an hour into the conversation, Dr. Tanner offered me a soft drink. I gladly took the offer, considering that my parents never allowed me to drink soda. Dr. Tanner reached over to his mini fridge and fidgeted around before setting down 2 open cans of soda on the desk. Afterwards, we continued to talk about what was going on in my life, but it wasn't long before I passed out from whatever drugs Dr. Tanner placed in my drink. It took me a minute or so to adjust my blurred vision upon waking, and when it did, I had no idea what to think. I was handcuffed to a bed, and my mouth was sealed with duct tape. I immediately began to panic, squirming and tugging at the cuffs, but gave up soon after. My eyes widened in disbelief after looking around the room. There were posters of superheroes pinned up along the walls, and photographs of famous athletes on shelves. In the middle of the room was an old television Super Nintendo, various game cartridges stacked alongside it. I didn't know what to think. Here I am in a room filled with items most kids would die to play with. I would have probably cried from joy had I not been handcuffed to a bed frame. My stomach sank once again as the door opened and Dr. Tanner walked inside. He sat down on the edge of the bed. "Now listen," he said. "Remember that I'm here to help you, and I would never hurt you, okay?" Dr. Tanner gently removed the tape from my mouth, and then the cuffs from my hands. My first instinct was to begin crying, but something about Dr. Tanner made me feel safe. He smiled at me. "You're going to be staying here for a while," he continued. "And during this time, you're allowed to play with any toys in this room while I'm here at home. But when I leave the house, I'll need to cuff one of your hands back to the bed. You can still watch the television, but I want you to only watch the news channels while I'm away." I sat in silence, still trying to process the information he'd given me. "So," Dr. Tanner yipped, slapping me on the knee, "you go ahead and knock yourself out. I'll be back when it's time for dinner." He got up from the bed, walked across the room and clicked the TV's power button before locking the door behind him. Several more minutes passed before I realized that Dr. Tanner wasn't joking. All that was left for me to do was boot up the Nintendo and play Mario until nightfall. At about 7 p.m., Dr. Tanner returned to the room carrying 2 plates of mashed potatoes and chicken strips. I finally gathered up the courage to ask him how long I'd be staying in this room. "Well, about a month," he replied. "Give or take a few weeks. I just have some work I need to do." The following morning, I awoke to Dr. Tanner's hand patting my head. "Hey, bud, you don't have to wake up right now if you don't want, but I'm gonna need to put this back on," he whispered, clamping the cold steel handcuff onto my wrist. I gazed up at him. He was wearing a collared shirt and slacks, a coat draped over his shoulder and a suitcase at his side. He looked just how he always did when I saw him around school. Before leaving, he placed the TV's remote next to me and told me to turn it on and watch the news. The first thing I saw upon turning it on was a breaking news segment. An important-looking police officer stood at a podium, surrounded by people with microphones. I happened to begin viewing halfway through his speech. "A statewide Amber Alert has been issued as of this morning. We have several investigators working towards identifying potential abductors. But as of right now, there is not much evidence. Faculty members state that the boy had last been seen around 4 or 5 in the evening on of." I began to feel nauseous as a photograph of me appeared on the screen. It was my yearbook picture from last year. Captions for the photograph displayed my name and age, my school, and my town. Above my picture were alternating titles. "FBI begins search for child," and "Kidnapping suspect unknown," and "Potential runaway." The live footage continued, and 2 figures I soon recognized as my mum and dad stepped up to the podium. Both appeared to have reddened eyes. Tears streamed down my mother's face as she took hold of the microphone. I'd never seen so much emotion come from my mother before, as she wept on live television, stuttering on such sentences as, "Please return my baby back to me," and "I'm so sorry," and "Please come home to us." When my father took the microphone, I nearly expected his attitude to be stone cold, but he too had tears in his eyes. He pleaded to the world to bring his son home safely, and lastly begged for my forgiveness. "I know I haven't been the best father, but God damn it, I wish I had been now. Please bring my boy back." I turned the power off shortly after. My emotions were mixed, for I'd never once seen my father cry. I felt miserable that my parents were being put through so much, but at the same time, I felt relief. I now know how much Mum and Dad love me. Nearly 4 weeks have passed, and Dr. Tanner has been treating me with the utmost respect. He leaves me in the morning cuffed to the bed frame, but returns in the afternoon to eat lunch and dinner with me, to talk and play games. I would never have guessed how good Dr. Tanner was at Monopoly and Scrabble. But one morning, when Dr. Tanner woke me before heading off to work, I noticed a stern look on his face. I also realized that it was 3 hours earlier than when he normally wakes me. You need to watch the news today. No exceptions. I want you to keep the television on all day and pay close attention to it, he stated grimly. I, of course, complied and watched him exit the room. About 2 hours later, a breaking news segment interrupted the toothpaste commercial I was watching. The title? Human remains found. 2 staunch men in suits stood aside one another and began speaking.
We are displeased to bring up such unfortunate news this morning regarding our missing child case from earlier this month.
One of the men bowed his head while the one speaking shuffled through some papers. He continued.
Remains of a body have been found in a garbage bag beneath a highway overpass. The body appears to be that of a child, although not much of it is left. The body has been decapitated and much has been burnt to ash and bone.
The screen shifted over to a helicopter view of the freeway. Dozens of police cars gathered near the bottom of a tall overpass. The man's voice could still be heard.
Within the bag, police found a junior high school identification card labeled as such.
The screen showed the school ID card I always kept in my backpack. The plastic was sort of melted away, but my photograph and name were intact. After the two men dismissed themselves, the camera panned over to my parents. They were sitting among reporters. My mother's face held a painful grimace, and my father sulked his head down at his knees. I shut the television off. Dr. Tanner returned home very late. He hurried into the room, unlocked my cuffs, and placed a bottle of fizzing water into my hand. He placed his hands onto my shoulders and smiled. I made you a promise, didn't I? I nodded, tears squeezing their way out of my eyes. You need to make me a promise again, he whispered. He told me that I needed to drink all the water in the bottle. It would help me sleep, and that from here on, I am never to tell anyone that I ever met him. I promised. I told you I'm the best school psychologist in the world, didn't I? And he was right. I woke later that night to find myself lying in the middle of a park, stars shining brilliantly across the sky. I recognized the park. It wasn't too far from my school. A mile or so down the road, I saw my house. The lights were off inside, but I could make out my father sitting on the step leading to the front door. I hesitantly called out to him. He lifted his head slowly, but when he saw it was me, he sprang to his feet, ran towards me, arms open, yelling my name. My mother erupted from the house behind him. Dr. Tanner was right. Things have changed with my family and I. My parents smile more often and treat me lovingly. I could not ask for a more perfect ending. Every now and then, I see Dr. Tanner on campus, walking to and from his office. Rarely do we ever make eye contact, let alone speak to one another. But sometimes he'll shoot me a wink and a smile. I'll always keep my promise to him and pretend I never met him. But there will always be one question forever floating in my mind. Who did Dr. Tanner decapitate and throw off the overpass?
The Midnight Game Ritual. Originally posted on October 12th, 2014. The Midnight Game is an old pagan ritual used mainly as punishment for those who have broken the laws of the pagan religion in question. While it was mainly used as a scare tactic to not disobey the gods, there is still a very existent chance of death to those who play the midnight game, there is an even higher chance of permanent mental scarring. It is highly recommended that you do not play the midnight game. However, for those few thrill seekers searching for a rush, or for those delving into obscure occult rituals, these are simple instructions on how to play. Do so at your own risk. Prerequisites. It must be exactly 12 o'clock a.m. when you begin performing the ritual. Otherwise, it will not work. Materials. You will need a candle, a piece of paper, a writing implement, matches or a lighter, salt, a wooden door, and at least one drop of your own blood. If you are playing with multiple people, they will need their own of the aforementioned materials, and they will have to perform the steps below accordingly. Step 1. Write your full name, first, middle, and last, on the piece of paper. Put at least one drop of blood on the paper and allow it to soak into the paper. Step 2. Turn off all of the lights in the place you are doing this. Go to your wooden door and place the paper with your name on it in front of the door. Now, take out the candle and light it. Place it on top of the paper. Step 3. Knock on the door 22 times. The hour must be 12 o'clock a.m. upon the final knock. Then, open the door, blow out the candle, and close the door. You have just allowed the Midnight Man to enter your house. Step 4. Immediately relight your candle. This is where the game begins. You must now lurk around your now completely dark house with the lit candle in your hand. Your goal is to avoid the Midnight Man at all costs until 3:33 a.m. Should your candle ever go out, that means the Midnight Man is near you. You must relight your candle in the next 10 seconds. If you are not successful in doing this, you must then immediately surround yourself with a circle of salt. If you are unsuccessful in both of your actions, the Midnight Man will create a hallucination of your greatest fear and rip out your organs, one by one. Yes, you will feel it. And yes, you will be unable to react. If you are successful in creating the circle of salt, you must remain in there until 3:33 a.m. If you are successful in relighting your candle, you may proceed with the game. You must continue to 3:33 a.m. without being attacked by the Midnight Man or being trapped inside the circle of salt to win the midnight game. The Midnight Man will leave your house at 3:33 a.m. and you will be safe to proceed with your morning. In addition, indications that you are near the Midnight Man will include sudden drops in temperature, seeing a pure black, humanoid figure through the darkness and hearing very soft whispering coming from an indiscernible source. If you experience any of these, it is advised that you leave the area to avoid the Midnight Man. Do not turn any of the lights on during the midnight game. Do not use a flashlight during the midnight game. Do not go to sleep during the midnight game. Do not attempt to use another person's blood on your name. Do not use a lighter as a substitute for a candle. I can assure you, it will not work. And definitely, do not attempt to provoke the Midnight Man in any way. Even when the game is over, he will always be watching you. Good luck, my friend. You are going to need it. Tulpa. Last year, I spent 6 months participating in what I was told was a psychological experiment. I found an ad in my local paper looking for imaginative people looking to make good money, and since it was the only ad that week that I was remotely qualified for, I gave them a call and we arranged an interview. They told me that all I would have to do is stay in a room alone with sensors attached to my head to read my brain activity. And while I was there, I would visualize a double of myself. They called it my tulpa. It seemed easy enough, and I agreed to do it as soon as they told me how much I would be paid. And the next day, I began. They brought me to a simple room and gave me a bed, then attached sensors to my head and hooked them up into a little black box on the table beside me. They talked me through the process of visualizing my double again and explained that if I got bored or restless, instead of moving around, I should visualize my double moving around, or try to interact with him, and so on. The idea was to keep him with me the entire time I was in the room. I had trouble with it for the first few days. It was more controlled than any sort of daydreaming I've done before. I'd imagine my double for a few minutes, then grow distracted. But by the 4th day, I could manage to keep him present for the entire 6 hours. They told me I was doing very well. The 2nd week, they gave me a different room with wall-mounted speakers. They told me that they wanted to see if I could still keep the tulpa with me in spite of distracting stimuli. The music was discordant, ugly, and unsettling, and it made the process a little more difficult. But I managed nonetheless. The next week, they played even more unsettling music, punctuated with shrieks, feedback loops, and what sounded like an old-school modem dialing up, with guttural voices speaking some foreign language. But I just laughed it off. By then, I was a pro. After about a month, I started to get bored. To liven things up, I started interacting with my doppelganger. We'd have conversations, or play rock, paper, scissors, or I'd imagine him juggling, or breakdancing, or whatever caught my fancy at the time. I asked the researchers if my foolishness would adversely affect their study, but they encouraged me to continue. So we played and communicated, and that was fun for a while. And then, it got a little strange. I was telling him about my first date one day, and he corrected me. I'd said my date was wearing a yellow top, and he told me it was a green one. I thought about it for a second and realized he was right. It creeped me out, and after my shift that day, I talked to the researchers about it. You're using the thought form to access your subconscious, they explained. You knew on some level that you were wrong, and you subconsciously corrected yourself. What had once been creepy was suddenly cool. I was talking to my subconscious. It took some practice, but I found that I could question my tulpa and access all sorts of memories. I could make it quote whole pages of books I'd read once, years before, or things I was taught and immediately forgot in high school. It was awesome. That was around the time when I started calling up my double outside of the research center. Not often at first, but I was so used to imagining him by now that it almost seemed odd to not see him. So whenever I was bored, I'd visualize my double. Eventually, I started doing it almost all the time. It was amusing to take him along like an invisible friend. I imagined him when I was hanging out with friends or visiting my mom. Heck, I even brought him along a date once. I didn't need to speak aloud to him, so I was able to carry out conversations with him, and no one was the wiser. I know that sounds strange, but it was fun. Not only was he a walking repository of everything I knew and everything I had forgotten, he also seemed more in touch with me than I did at times. He had an uncanny grasp of body language that I didn't even realize I was picking up on. For example, I thought the date I brought him on was going along badly, but he pointed out how she was laughing a little too hard at my jokes and leaning towards me as I spoke, and a bunch of other subtle clues I wasn't consciously picking up on. I listened, and let's just say that date went very well. By the time I'd been at the research center for 4 months, he was with me constantly. The researchers approached me one day after my shift and asked me if I stopped visualizing him. I denied it, and they seemed pleased. I silently asked my double if he knew what prompted that, but he just shrugged it off. So did I. I withdrew a little from the world at that point. I was having trouble relating to people. It seemed to me that they were so confused and unsure of themselves, while I had a manifestation of myself to confer with. It made socializing awkward. Nobody else seemed aware of their reasons behind their actions, why some things made them mad and others made them laugh. They didn't know what moved them, but I did. Well, at least I could ask myself and get an answer. A friend confronted me one evening. He pounded at the door until I answered it and came in fuming and swearing up a storm. "You haven't answered when I called you in fucking weeks, you dick!" he yelled. "What's your fucking problem?" I was about to apologize to him and probably would have offered to hit the bars with him that night, but my tulpa grew suddenly furious.
"Hit him,"
it said, and before I knew what I was doing, I had. I heard his nose break. He fell to the floor and came up swinging, and we beat each other up and down my apartment. I was more furious than I had ever been, and I was not merciful. I knocked him to the ground and gave him 2 savage kicks to the ribs, and that's when he fled, hunched over and sobbing. The police were there a few minutes later, but I told them that he had been the instigator, and since he wasn't around to refute me, they let me go with a warning. My tulpa was grinning the entire time. And oh, how he spent the night crowing about my victory and sneering over how badly I'd beaten him. It wasn't until the next morning, when I was checking out my black eye and cut lip in the mirror, that I remembered what had set me off. My double was the one who'd grown furious, not me. I'd been feeling guilty and a little ashamed, but he'd goaded me into a vicious fight with just a concerned friend. He was present, of course, and knew my thoughts.
You don't need him anymore. You don't need anyone else,
he told me, and I felt my skin crawl. I explained all this to the researchers who employed me, but they just laughed it off. You can't be scared of something you're imagining, one told me. My double stood beside him and nodded his head, then smirked at me. I tried to take their words to heart, but over the next few days, I found myself growing more and more anxious around my tulpa, and it seemed that he was changing. He looked taller and more menacing. His eyes twinkled with mischief, and I saw malice in his constant smile. No job was worth losing my mind over, I decided. If he was out of control, I'd put him down. I was so used to him at that point that visualizing him was an automatic process, so I started trying my damnedest to not visualize him. It took a few days, but it started to work somewhat. I could get rid of him for hours at a time, but every time he came back, he seemed worse. His skin seemed ashen, his teeth more pointed. He hissed and gibbered and threatened and swore. The discordant music I'd been listening to for months seemed to accompany him everywhere. Even when I was at home, I'd relax and sit up, no longer concentrating on not seeing him, and there he'd be, a howling noise with him. I was still visiting the research center and spending my 6 hours there. I needed the money, and I thought they weren't aware that I was now actively not visualizing my tulpa. But I was wrong. After my shift one day, about 5.5 months in, 2 impressive men grabbed me and restrained me, and someone in a lab coat jabbed a hypodermic needle into my body. I woke up from my stupor back in the room, strapped into the bed, music blaring, with my doppelganger standing over me, cackling. He hardly looked like a human anymore. His features were twisted, his eyes were sunken in their sockets and filmed over like a corpse's. He was much taller than me, but hunched over. His hands were twisted, and the fingernails were like talons. He was, in short, fucking terrifying. I tried to will him away, but I couldn't seem to concentrate. He giggled and tapped the IV in my arm. I thrashed my restraints as best I could, but I could hardly move at all.
They're pumping you full of the good shit. How's the mind? All fuzzy?
He leaned closer and closer as he spoke, and I gagged. His breath smelled like spoiled meat. I tried to focus, but I couldn't banish him. The next few weeks were terrible. Every so often, someone in a doctor's coat would come in and inject me with something, or force feed me a pill. They kept me dizzy and unfocused, and sometimes left me hallucinating or delusional. My thought form was still present, constantly mocking me. He interacted with, or perhaps caused, my delusions. I hallucinated that my mother was there, scolding me. And then he cut her throat, and her blood showered me. It was so real that I could taste it. The doctors never spoke to me. I begged at times, screamed, hurled invectives, demanded answers, but they still never said a word. They may have spoken to my tulpa, my personal monster, but I'm not sure. I was so doped and confused that it might have just been another delusion, but I remember them talking with him. I grew convinced that he was the real one and I was the thought form. He encouraged that line of thought at times and mocked me at others. Another thing that I pray was a delusion is that he could touch me. More than that, he could hurt me. He'd poke and prod at me if he felt I wasn't paying enough attention to him. Once, he grabbed my testicles and squeezed until I told him I loved him. Another time, he slashed my forearm with one of his talons. I still have the scar. Most days I can convince myself that I injured myself and just hallucinated that he was responsible. But that's only sometimes. Then, one day, while he was telling me a story about how he's going to gut everyone I loved, starting with my sister, he paused. A malicious look crossed his face, and he reached out and touched my head, like my mother used to do when I was feverish. He stayed still for a long moment, then smiled.
All thoughts are creative.
Then he walked out of the room. 3 hours later, I was given an injection and passed out. I awoke unrestrained. Shaking, I made my way to the door and found it unlocked. I walked out into the empty hallway and then ran. I stumbled more than once, but I made it down the stairs and out into the lot behind the building. There, I collapsed, weeping like a child, but I knew I had to keep moving. I got home eventually. I don't remember how, but I know I locked the door and shoved a dresser against it, took a long shower, and slept for a day and a half. Nobody came for me in the night, and nobody came the next day, or the one after that. It was over. I'd spent a week locked in that room, but it had felt like a century. I'd withdrawn so much from my life beforehand that nobody had even known that I was missing. The police didn't find anything. The research center was empty when they searched it. The paper trail fell apart. The names I'd given them were aliases, and even the money I'd received was apparently untraceable. I recovered as much as one can. I didn't leave the house much, and I have panic attacks whenever I do. I don't sleep much, and my nightmares are terrible. It's over, I tell myself. I survived. I used the concentration method those bastards taught me to convince myself. It does work. Sometimes. Not today, though. 3 days before, I got a call from my mother. There's been a tragedy. My sister's the latest victim in a spree of killings, the police say. The perpetrator mugs his victims, then guts them. The funeral was this afternoon, and it was as lovely as a service can be. I was a little distracted though. All I could hear was music coming from somewhere distant. Discordant, unsettling stuff that sounds like feedback and shrieking, just like a modem dialing up. I hear it still. A little louder now. Pale Luna. Written by Ed. In the last decade and a half, it's become infinitely easier to obtain exactly what you're looking for by way of a couple of keystrokes. The internet has made it all too simple to use a computer to change reality. An abundance of information is merely a search engine away, to the point where it's hard to imagine life as any different. Yet, a generation ago, when the words streaming and torrent were meaningless, save for conversations about water, people met face to face to conduct software swap parties, trading games and applications on Sharpie labeled 5¼ inch floppies. Of course, most of the time these meets were a way for frugal, community-minded individuals to trade popular games like King's Quest and Maniac Mansion amongst themselves. However, a few early programming talents designed their own computer games to share amongst their circle of acquaintances, who in turn would pass it on, until, if fun and well designed enough, an independently developed game had its place in the collection of aficionados across the country. Pale Luna, on the other hand, was never circulated outside of the San Francisco Bay Area. All known copies have been long disposed of. All computers that have ever run the game now deterrence, buried under layers of filth. This fact is attributed to a number of rather abstruse design choices made by its programmer. Pale Luna was a text adventure in the vein of Zork and the Lurking Horror at a time when said genre was swiftly going out of fashion. Upon booting the program, the player was presented with a screen almost completely blank, except for the text.
You are in a dark room. Moonlight shines through a window. There is gold in the corner, along with a shovel and a rope. There is a door to the east. Command.
So began the game that one writer for a long out-of-print fanzine decried as enigmatic, nonsensical, and completely unplayable, as the only commands that the game would accept were pick up gold, pick up shovel, pick up rope, open door, and go east. The player was soon presented with the following.
Reap your reward. Pale Luna smiles at you. You are in a forest. There are paths to the north, west, and east. Command.
What quickly infuriated the few who played the game was the confusing and buggy nature of the second screen onward. Only one of the directional decisions would be the correct one. For example, on this occasion, a command to go in a direction other than north would lead to the system freezing, requiring the operator to hard reboot the entire computer. Further, any subsequent screens seemed to merely repeat the above text, with the difference being only the directions available. Worse still, the standard text adventure commands appeared to be useless. The only accepted non-movement related prompts were use gold, which caused the game to display the message,
Not here.
use shovel, which brought up,
Not now.
and use rope, which prompted the text,
You've already used this.
Most who have played the game progressed a couple of screens into it before becoming fed up by constantly having to reboot and tossing the disc in disgust, writing off the experience as a shoddily programmed farce. However, there is one thing about the world of computers that remains true. No matter the era, some people who use them have way too much time on their hands. A young man by the name of Michael Nevins decided to see if there was more to Pale Luna than what met the eye. 5 hours and 33 screens worth of trial and error and unplugged computer cords later, he finally managed to make the game display different text. The text in this new area read,
Pale Luna smiles wide. There are no paths. Pale Luna smiles wide. The ground is soft. Pale Luna smiles wide. Here. Command.
It was another hour still before Nevin stumbled upon the proper combination of phrases to make the game progress any further. Dig hole, drop gold, then fill hole. This caused the screen to display,
Congratulations. 40.24248 minus 121.4434.
upon which the game ceased to accept commands, requiring the user to reboot one last time. After some deliberation, Nevins came to the conclusion that the numbers referred to lines of latitude and longitude. The coordinates led to a point in the sprawling forest that dominated the nearby Lassen Volcanic Park. As he possessed much more free time than sense, Nevins vowed to see Pale Luna through its ending. The next day, armed with a map, a compass, and a shovel, he navigated the park's trails, noting with amusement how each turn he made corresponded roughly to those he took in-game. Though he initially regretted bringing the cumbersome digging tool on a mere hunch, the path similarity all but confirmed his suspicions that the journey would end with him face to face with an eccentric's buried treasure. Out of breath after a tricky struggle through the coordinates, he was pleasantly surprised by a literal stumble upon a patch of uneven dirt. Shoveling as excitedly as he was, it would be an understatement to say that he was taken aback when his heavy strokes unearthed the badly decomposing head of a blonde-haired little girl. Nevins promptly reported the situation to the authorities. The girl was identified as 11-year-old Karen Paulson, reported as missing to the San Diego Police Department a year and a half prior. Efforts were made to track down the programmer of Pale Luna, but the nearly anonymous legal gray area in which the software swapping community operated inescapably led to many dead ends. Collectors have been known to offer upwards of 6 figures for an authentic copy of the game. The rest of Karen's body was never found. The Black Friday Incident. by Patrick Donahue. The early stages of the production on the film Toy Story were a complete nightmare. The production was in a sort of development hell until the infamous Black Friday incident. Disney harassed the then new animation studio, Pixar, constantly. They were to produce and release the film, and they wanted results as quickly as possible. Disney tried everything to eliminate Pixar's efforts to deviate from the Disney formula, even at times threatening to shut the whole production down. Disney sent notes on revisions that they thought would improve the film. They insisted through their notes, which all read, "Edge. The film needs more edge." The people working on the film at that time struggled so hard to maintain all of Disney's notes and demands. Once a week, they were required to fly across the country to the Disney offices to present them with progress. Every time, though, they were met with the same response. Edge. The film needs more edge. Pixar revised the film so hard to meet the deadlines that it resulted in some rather interesting changes. In order to achieve edge, the film became quite a lot darker. Woody became a wildly unlikable character, much more angry and far less comedic than in the final film. Bo Peep's role in the story was far more prevalent, often flirtatious towards the male characters, and is the first to accuse Woody of pushing Buzz out of the window. Buzz Lightyear was referred to at this point in production as Lunar Larry. He is highly reminiscent of an older superhero, talking in a deeper voice, and is even more deluded and ignorant of his surroundings. The other toys were relatively unchanged, save for minor aesthetic differences. Pixar employees worked literally 24/7, non-stop. Director John Lasseter joked on more than one occasion that he had the best parking space at the office because his car hadn't moved for over 3 days. Some of the writers and storyboard artists began to suffer from chronic insomnia. A few writers reported seeing visions of Buzz and Woody taunting them on their lack of progress, chanting, "Edge. The film needs more edge." Many of the initial workers quit due to the stress it was putting on their personal lives, much to the distress of the remaining crew. By November of 1992, there were 2 of the 5 writers left, and only 1 of the 3 storyboard artists. The remaining storyboard artist was named Ralph Thompson. He joined the Pixar team in the winter of 1987, working on short films such as Tin Toy and Knick Knack. He, at that same time, did some storyboard work for The Nightmare Before Christmas with fellow artist Joe Ranft. Joe came down with a serious illness and hadn't been able to work in a week. Ralph worked constantly in fear of the inevitable correction by Disney. More edge. More edge. More edge. Each presentation meant another row of sleepless nights of rewriting and redrawing the same characters in the same bedroom over and over and over and over. It was maddening. One morning, John Lasseter, Andrew Satin, and other higher-ups at Pixar came into the office and told everyone what happened at their last meeting. Disney felt that things were not looking good for the film and demanded that in less than a week, they see the complete film in story reels, which are storyboards with audio, with massive revisions. There was a general groan and whining from the crew, and they went back to working. Ralph worked harder than all others involved. Sometimes, at 2 o'clock in the morning, one of the writers would walk into Ralph's office with a pack of newly written scenes. More to draw. And with more drawings meant more scratch voice work. When a film is still in the writing/storyboarding phases, artists will do temporary voices for the story reels. He had Disney's vague instructions racing through his mind. More edge, more! We want results, people. Edgier. This is a business, so faster, more edge, move on already. He thought this to himself exactly. The film needed an edge. It needed to be darker, more cynical. It needed more adult humor in situations. It needed an attitude. Of course, Ralph, you goddamn retard. How couldn't you have seen it sooner? Edge. All of those hundreds of hours bent over a desk. All you needed was edge. Why didn't you listen sooner? And that's what he did. He gave the film an edge. The story reels were flown over with the main crew to the head offices at Disney. The date was November 27th, 1992. Black Friday. The film was brought into the Disney screening room. The reel was about 48.5 minutes long. The movie started out as a Western-style shootout between Woody and Andy, resulting in Andy being shot down. It is revealed that this was just a game played inside of Andy's mind. The film continued on with little problems for about the first 20 minutes or so, though several gags seemed off with the overall tone of the film. For example, Mr. Potato Head would pull out one of his eyes and kick them under Bo Peep's dress for a look-see. There were several scenes of Woody yelling at the toys to stop caring about Buzz or Larry and to pay attention to him, culminating in insults and minor acts of violence. The scene comes where Andy can only take one toy to Pizza Planet and Woody pushes Buzz out of the window. Woody offers to shake hands with Buzz or Larry, only to throw him out of the window. There's a stock smashing noise. The other toys are shocked and antagonize Woody for what he has done. Woody shows little remorse and screams at Slinky Dog to make the other toys stop harassing him. After much yelling, one of the Green Army men saying the word, "God damn!" The toys grab Woody and toss him out of the window as well. He falls onto the ground with a low thump as cheering is heard from the interior of the house. The quality on the storyboards becomes much less refined and almost like chicken scratch. Woody gets up and sees Buzz, his body shattered on impact. His arms and legs were broken off and located only a few inches away. There was a large crack down the middle of the chest, revealing a mess of buttons and wires inside. He gave off a sort of electrical twitch motion in his head. His eyes looked as if they were right about to pop out of their plastic sockets. The twitching stops after a few moments, and Woody looks in fear at what he has done to Buzz and runs off. There's a jump cut to the scene where the two get stuck in a claw machine. The storyboard art is back to its normal level of quality. The machine is filled with sunglasses-wearing pizzas as opposed to the aliens in the finished movie. Buzz is completely unharmed and intact. The scene is almost verbatim to the final film. Sid, the antagonist in control of the claw machine, is wearing a yellow t-shirt and is smoking 3 cigarettes at once. The claw grabs Woody and Buzz and puts them in the clutches of Sid. There is another jump cut, once again returning to the chicken scratch style of artwork. The scene is inside of Sid's room. Woody looks around the room in fear. He tiptoes around the room and collapses after seeing one of Sid's mutant toys. The reel now shows unrelated test animation of the characters running, a few seconds of Buzz running in place, and a few seconds of Woody running, and nearly a minute of the two running together. The footage is distorted and Spanish text is present on the screen. There's now a shot of Woody standing in front of a black background, and the trademark Pixar ball is rolling around in the distance. The animation now is the traditional animation style of a typical 2D Disney film. Woody is completely naked, with anatomically correct features, and stares directly into the camera. His flesh begins to rot away with the exception of his eyes, which remain intact. Woody begins to moan in a low voice. What remains of his lips curl into a smile, bits of flesh peeling off as this happens. He lifts up his decomposing arm manually and weighs into the camera. His fingers dig into his eyes. Dark blood oozes out of their sockets. Woody begins to scream and growl. "Don't you want it?
Don't you want it?
Don't you love it?
He digs so deep as to rip the entire top of his head off. Woody gives a sigh of relief and begins eating the flesh off of the skull before tossing it aside. He writes the word edge onto the screen with his rotting fingertips. The remaining 15 minutes of the reels were pencil scribbles accompanied by the shrill screams of a young woman. The word edge is burned into the projection screen. The screening ended in complete silence. Chairman of Disney at that time, Jeffrey Katzenberg, walked out of the screening quietly, telling his colleagues, "Notes. They were following all the notes we were giving them." Upon returning to Pixar offices, writer Pete Docter found the body of Ralph Thompson in an enormous pile of paper in his office. Further analysis found that the cause of his death was a heart attack brought on by a lack of sleep and stress. The papers were all storyboards and animation cells of the final coherent scene of Woody, the word edge scrawled on the back of each one. After the Black Friday screening, Disney was far less involved with the film. Pixar was given the freedom to make the film their way. The film went on to be a huge success both critically and financially. But the Black Friday incident still remains very much a mystery. To those curious, there is a short bonus feature on the Toy Story Blu-ray about the incident, curiously not mentioning the more notable scenes. It can also be found on YouTube for anyone who is curious to see the whitewashed history. Disney produced the short documentary to avoid discussing about the incident. If you contact them about it, you'll probably be redirected to the Blu-ray's Amazon page. That is, if you get a response at all. Let's Not Meet. How I Found Out Someone Was Living in My House. Written by The Bella Bubbles. About a year ago, for the month of June, my family went to France for 4 weeks and left me to tend to the house and take care of the animals. My house is in quite the interesting location. It is an hour from the campus I go to school on, and a 30-minute drive from my work, and 20 minutes from the main town. My neighbors and I have a few acres in between each other, and the closest house to me is a 10-minute drive. The property is surrounded by farmers' fields, military land, and then miles and miles of BLM property surrounded by mountains. Sometimes I feel like I live in the house from Courage the Cowardly Dog because of how in the middle of nowhere it is, and how lots of weird stuff happens in it. If you were to Google what a 2-story house looks like, this would be exactly what my house looks like. Except, it's only 1 story. The 2nd story, where all the windows are, is just ceiling and space. There are also lofts in my house where my landlord was going to put the 2nd story, but never got around to it. It was like they tried to build a 2-story house, but realized that there was nowhere to put a stairwell. There is also a large basement and an attic. I have lived in this house for 8 years and have always felt that the house had a weird layout. Next to my room, there's a huge wall that connects to the living room wall. But my room isn't as big as the wall, so there's just a large wall in between the living room and my room, and underneath my room is the stairs that leads to an unfinished basement. Now that you understand the layout of my house, you'd understand why there would be a lot of bird nests on the roof. The birds congregate on top of the room during the summer because that's when the most bugs are out for them to catch, and because we feed our cat just below it. My room acts like a funnel for the noise of them scratching on the roof and running around. About 2 weeks after my family left for France, the birds started their scratching noises on top of my roof. They do it every hour or so, all day and all night. It's a very unsettling sound to hear at 3 in the morning, and of course, it's annoying. Then I started to hear scratching and banging sounds coming from the wall next to me, which is why I thought we had rats in our walls. My mom assured me over Skype that it was probably just birds on the roof like normal. But the next few days, I kept hearing the scratching noises and the banging coming from the wall. Finally, I decided that it was time to check the closets and the basements for signs of mice or rats so I could buy the proper traps. After checking the basement, I didn't find any signs of mice, so I went to go check the hall closet, which is the only thing in between my living room and my room. It's usually locked because it's full of a bunch of yard tools, my stepdad's shotgun, my archery equipment, and a handgun. As you can guess, it's locked because my youngest brother could seriously injure himself. I assumed that it was locked, but I still went to check the handle to see if it opened. I thought maybe my stepdad unlocked it before they left in case I needed the gun to protect myself. The first thing I noticed when I opened the closet is that all of the tools are moved to the far side, and a portion of the closet wall is missing. At this point, I'm freaking the frack out and call my best friend and her dad to come over and check it out. I thought about calling the police, but since I live far out from a lot of things, I figured me discovering a hole in the wall of my closet probably wasn't enough motivation to send them out. My best friend's dad and brother came over and used flashlights to look into the hole. They didn't see anything super weird, so my friend's dad gets on his hands and knees and gets into the hole. When he gets out, he has a look of horror on his face and tells us that he found a dirty mattress, a pair of men's-sized jeans, chicken feathers everywhere, and a whole Walmart rotisserie chicken, partially eaten. He calls the police, and they search the whole house and find no one and nothing out of the ordinary. My friend's dad nails a slab of wood over the hole, and I have all the locks changed. The creepy compartment in my closet has since been sealed up. The scary thing is that because I work during the day and leave the house unlocked most of the time, the guy who lived in there could have come and gone as he pleased until the night when I was home. I have 8 dogs, which is the reason why my family needed me to stay home, and I never heard any of them bark during the time the banging started. Which means the man probably lived in my house a long time, and my dogs just got used to him. The Tundra. Written by David Fueling. Originally posted on March 20th, 2015. The native villagers around these parts say that there's a stretch of tundra just north of here that is occupied by benevolent spirits. These spirits grant insight and warning to whoever visits them at night, once the sun has disappeared entirely and left the world in jet darkness. I drove out to the middle of the frozen expanse of ice and waited, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever commanded these people's reverence. They send their children out, bundled in furs to keep from freezing, on the eve of their 15th birthday, to seek an audience with these spirits. Once they have achieved this, the children run home to their parents to share the news. From then on, these children are considered adults in the village. Engaged couples visit this tundra on the night before their wedding. The entire village stays up all night, awaiting their return, as it is upon their return that the couple either decides to proceed with their marriage or to abandon it. The elderly visit the tundra whenever they are sick or ailing, and often make their condition worse by staying all night in the cold. When they return, however, it is most often with an air of sheer serenity. So, I waited, curious to see what phenomenon might inspire people so powerfully. I waited for hours, bundled in my parka and sitting on the hood of my pickup. I waited until I felt that I was going to freeze to death, even in my thick clothing. But then, I heard the spirit before I even saw it. A crunching of snow in the silence made me jump off my truck and spin around. A hunched, gray-skinned man stood a few meters away. Sad, yellowed eyes stared back at me, set inside a skull from which sprouted only a few greasy hairs. He breathed heavily with a rattle that showed his fragile ribcage, and one of his arms looked as if it had been messily broken, and one of his arms looked as if it had been messily broken and then neglected, allowing it to knit back together imperfectly. Badly scarred flesh marred his splayed legs. The man stared at me for perhaps 10 seconds, breathing in the frigid air and exhaling a sickly dribble of steam, before disappearing when I blinked my eyes. I spun around, looking for the man, but he was truly gone. Approaching where he had once stood, I found a pair of bloody footprints in the snow. Frantic with fear, I got into my pickup and headed for the village as fast as the ice would allow. A few villagers were waiting for me when I arrived, knowing that I had gone out and curious as to what might happen. I hastily got out of my truck and approaching the nearest villager, I demanded, "What is so benevolent about these spirits? What is so insightful? How do these spirits even help you?" "What did you even see?" he asked, the look on his face now mirroring the fear in mine. "I saw a man, horribly disfigured and desperately sick." The rest of the villagers around us backed away a step. "Why? What does that mean?" I begged him. "The spirits show only one thing. They show their visitors a year in the future." The Russian Sleep Experiment. Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 15 days using an experimental gas-based stimulant. They were kept in a sealed environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake so the gas didn't kill them, since it was toxic in high concentrations. This was before the days of closed-circuit cameras, so they only had microphones in 5-inch thick, glass porthole-sized windows into the chamber to monitor them. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep on, but no bedding, running water and toilet, and enough dried food to last all 5 for over a month. The test subjects were political prisoners deemed enemies of the state during World War II. Everything was fine for the first 5 days. The subjects hardly complained, having been promised falsely that they would be freed if they submitted to the test and did not sleep for 30 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored, and it was noted that they continued to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their past, and the general tone of their conversations took on a darker aspect after the 4-day mark. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and events that led them to where they were, and started to demonstrate severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began alternatively whispering to the microphones and one-way mirrored portholes. Oddly, they all seemed to think they could win the trust of their experimenters by turning over their comrades, the other subjects in captivity with them. At first, the researchers suspected that this was an effect of the gas itself. Though, after 9 days, the first of them started screaming. He ran the length of the chamber, repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. He continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce occasional squeaks. The researchers postulated that he had physically torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about this behavior is how the other captives reacted to it. Or rather, didn't react to it. They continued whispering to the microphones until the second that the captives started to scream. The two non-screaming captives took the books apart, smeared page after page with their own feces, and pasted them calmly over the glass portholes. The screaming promptly stopped. So did the whispering to the microphones. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure they were working, since they thought it was impossible that no sound could be coming with 5 people inside. The oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that all 5 must still be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen 5 people would consume at a very heavy level of strenuous exercise. On the morning of the 14th day, the researchers did something they said they would not do to get a reaction from the captives. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke any response from the captives they were afraid were either dead or vegetables. They announced,
"We are opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor, or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom."
To their surprise, they heard a single phrase and a calm voice respond, "We no longer want to be freed." Debate broke out among the researchers and the military forces funding the research. Unable to provoke any more response using the intercom, it was finally decided to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and filled with fresh air, and immediately, voices from the microphones began to object. 3 different voices began begging, as if pleading for the life of loved ones, to turn the gas back on. The chamber was opened, and soldiers were sent in to retrieve the test subjects. They began to scream louder than ever, and so did the soldiers when they saw what was inside. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although no one could rightly call the state that any of them were in alive. The food rations past day 5 had not been so much as touched. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subjects' thighs and chest, stuffed into the drain in the center of the chamber, blocking the drain and allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of the water on the floor was actually blood was never determined. All 4 surviving test subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies. The destruction of flesh and exposed bone on their fingertips indicated that the wounds were inflicted by hand, not with teeth, as the researchers initially thought. Closer examination of the position and angles of the wounds indicated that most, if not all of them, were self-inflicted. The abdominal organs below the ribcage of all 4 test subjects had been removed, while the heart, lungs, and diaphragm remained in place. The skin and most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been ripped off, exposing the lungs through the ribcage. All the blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just been taken out and laid on the floor. Fanning out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the subjects. The digestive tract of all four could be seen to be working, digesting food. It quickly became apparent that what they were digesting was their own flesh that they had ripped off and eaten over the course of days. Most of the soldiers were Russian special operatives at the facility, but still, many refused to return to the chamber to remove the test subjects. They continued to scream to be left in the chamber and alternatively begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on, lest they fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out. Another was gravely injured by having his testicles ripped off and an artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. Another 5 of the soldiers lost their lives, if you count ones that committed suicide in the weeks following the incident. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured and he bled out almost instantly. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of a morphine derivative and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arm of one doctor. The heart was seen to beat for a full 2 minutes after he had bled out, to the point where there was more air in his vascular system than blood. Even after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone in reach and just repeating the word, "More!" over and over, weaker and weaker, until he finally fell silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begging for the gas, demanding to be kept awake. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room that the facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back within his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative that they had given him to prepare him for the surgery. He fought furiously against his restraints when the anesthetic gas was brought out to put him under. He managed to tear most of the way through a 4-inch wide leather strap on one wrist, even though the weight of a 200-pound soldier was sitting on his chest. It took only a little more anesthetic than normal to put him under, and the instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subject that died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had tripled the normal level of oxygen. His muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in his struggle to not be subdued. Most of them were from the force his own muscles had exerted on them. The second survivor had been the first of the group of 5 to start screaming. His vocal cords destroyed, he was unable to beg or object to surgery, and he only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. He shook his head yes when someone suggested, reluctantly, that they try the surgery without anesthetic, and did not react for the entire 6-hour procedure of placing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it should not be medically possible for the patient to still be alive. One terrified nurse assisting the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curled into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling. Assuming this must be something of drastic importance, the surgeon had a pen and pad fetched so the patient could write his message. It was simple. Keep cutting. The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic as well, although they had been injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation. The surgeon found it impossible to perform the operation while the patients laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subject could only follow the attending researchers with their eyes. The paralytic cleared their system in an abnormally short period of time, and they were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak, they were again asking for the stimulant gas. The researchers tried asking why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped out their own guts, and why they wanted to be given the gas again. Only one response was given. I must remain awake. All 3 subjects' restraints were reinforced and they were placed back into the chamber, awaiting determination as to what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors for having failed the stated goals of their project, considered euthanizing the surviving subjects. The commanding officer, an ex-KGB, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected, but were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, all 3 stopped struggling the moment it was let slip that they were going back on the gas. It was obvious that at this point, all 3 were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds with all his might. First left, then right, then left again for something to focus on. The remaining subject was holding his head off his pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired for EEG, most of the researchers were monitoring his brainwaves in surprise. They were normal most of the time, but sometimes flatlined inexplicably. It looked as if he were repeatedly suffering brain death before returning to normal. As they focused on the paper scrolling out of the brainwave monitor, only one nurse saw his eyes slip shut at the moment his head hit the pillow. His brainwaves immediately changed to that of deep sleep, then flatlined for the last time as his heart simultaneously stopped. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in now. His brainwaves showed the same flat lines as the one who had just died from falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside, as well as 3 researchers. One of the named 3 immediately drew his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes, then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. He pointed his gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to a bed, as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. "I won't be locked in here with these things! Not with you! What are you? I must know." The subject smiled. "Have you forgotten so easily? We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread." The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked out. "So nearly free." JVK 1166Z.ESP, featuring the voice work of the X Chemical. Some people might recall some momentary buzz caused a couple years ago by a particularly odd Morrowind mod. The file name was JVK 1166Z.ESP. It was never posted on any of the larger Elder Scrolls communities, usually just smaller boards and role-playing groups. I know in a few cases, rather than being posted, it was sent via PM or email to a chosen few. It was only up for a few days, to the best of my knowledge. It caused a buzz because it was known to be a virus, or seemed to be. If you tried to load the game with the mod active, it would hang at the initial load screen for a full hour and then crash to the desktop. If you let it get that far, your install of Morrowind, along with any save files you had, would become completely corrupted. Nobody could figure out what the mod was trying to do, since it couldn't be opened in the construction set. Eventually, warnings were given out not to use it if you found it, and things died down. About a year later, in a mod board I used to frequent, someone popped up with the mod again. He said that he was PM'd by a lurker who deleted his account immediately after sending. He also said that the person advised him to try playing the mod through DOSBox. For some reason, this worked. Well, sort of. The game was a bit laggy, and you couldn't get into the options, load game, the console, or really anything else other than the game itself. The quick save and quick load hot buttons worked, but that was it, and the quick save file seemed to just be part of the game file, so you couldn't get at it anymore. Some speculated that the changed game used an older graphics renderer, making DOSBox necessary. Yet, it didn't look any different. This part I can speak about from personal experience. When you start a new game in JVK, once you left the starting bit in the census office and came into the game proper, the first thing that you will notice is that the Prophecy has been severed box pops up. This is because every single NPC having to do with the main quest is dead. with the sole exception of Jager and Bargain, the last of the Dwemer. Their corpses never despawn, so you can check on all of them. In effect, you begin in a world that is doomed to start with. The second thing you notice is that you're losing health. It's only a bit, but it keeps happening, a little bit at a time. The longer you stay in one place, the quicker it seems to occur. If you let this health loss kill you, you'll find the cause. A figure we came to call the Assassin because he seemed to wear a retextured version of the Dark Brotherhood armor from Tribunal, even though the expansions don't work in JVK. It's all black, completely untextured, like he's just a hole in space. The way he moves, he gave me quite a start. The first time I saw him scuttling around my dead body, he crawls inhumanly on his hands and feet, his arms and legs splayed out like a spider. You'd usually only see him after death, crawling around and over your body just before the reload box popped up. Occasionally, you could catch a glimpse of him darting around a corner or crawling on the wall or ceiling. It made the game quite difficult to play at night. Other than that, the only noticeable difference is at night. At random intervals, every NPC in the game will go outside for a few minutes. During this time, the only thing that they will say when hailed is, "Watch the sky." Once they return to their normal behavior, they act like normal. Though, after a while, a player on the board discovered a new NPC named Tiras, a male drummer in the temple at Ghostgate. Two things are noticeable about this NPC. First is his robe, a unique article of clothing that was lovingly rendered with twinkling stars all across it, looking like a torn-off chunk of the night sky. The second is that all of his dialogue, in addition to showing up in the dialogue box, is voiced. You can skip it if you wish, but it all sounds like it's in the default male drummer voice. Some people said that they thought the voice was slightly different, but it was a very, very good imitation. I won't go into the details, but the questline he sends you on has to do with a dungeon referred to simply as the Citadel. Up until this point, the quests were all of a fairly generic, discover the secrets of the ancients bent. The entrance to this dungeon is on a small island far to the west of the Morrowind proper. I eventually discovered that if you use a scroll of Icarian flight at the westernmost part on the main landmass and jump directly west, you'd end up almost exactly at the island. Even though the dungeon is called the Citadel, it goes straight down. It dwarfs any other dungeon, both in size and difficulty. From a natural cave area, you'll proceed down into an ancestral tomb-looking area, then a Daedric ruin area, and then a Dwemer ruin area. I made it down to the Dwemer ruins before I quit. The creatures here were strong enough that a level 20 character would have to take care, and since you can't use the console in JVK, level 20 took a while to get to. Since quick save and quick load are your only options, it's all too easy to get yourself into an impossible situation too. I did, and I just didn't have the energy to start over. Now, what I'm telling you is based on what those few who went further reported. Past the Dwemer ruins, you find yourself in a level like the Dwemer ruins, but darker. Rather than the usual bronze, all the surfaces, including those of the creatures, are black. The sounds of machinery are loud here, and grow louder still, randomly. There's also steam or fog everywhere, limiting your vision to about 10 in-game feet or so. If you can make it through all of this, you will reach a hall that those who found it called the Portrait Room. Like the fire and torches or other effects from early 3D games, this room has picture frames that always face directly at you, no matter how you look at them. The images in the frames were always randomly chosen images from your My Pictures folder. On the board, the ones who got there had some fun posting screenshots of the portrait room with various pictures in their frames. Usually porn, of course. At the end of the hall was a locked door. After admitting defeat and returning to Tyrus, everyone just found him saying, "Watch the sky," in his gravelly voice. What's more, nobody else in the game would say anything. There was just a completely blank dialogue box with no options at all. They wouldn't even rattle off the usual canned audible greetings. The only exception was at night. Whenever they'd go out for their few minutes, they'd still repeat it. Watch the sky. At this point, one of the players, a friend of mine from the board, noticed, and the few others who got this far agreed, that the night sky was no longer the usual night sky of Tamriel. It had changed to a depiction of the real night sky, and it moved. From this point on, everything is based on what this one person reported. Eventually, he got himself kicked from the board, but I kept in contact with him for as long as he responded. According to him, based on the constellations and planets, the sky started around February of 2005. If you died, loaded, or went back into the Citadel, it would start over. When the usual day sky graphics took over, the movement would be suspended until the stars appeared again. In the space of a single night, everything would move about 2 months' worth. Since the timescale of JVK was more or less of that of the standard game, that meant that a bit less than an hour would equal to a 24-hour period. He became convinced that the door would open based on some kind of celestial event. Of course, waiting for that meant leaving the game running. Of course, that meant that the game couldn't be left unattended thanks to our old friend the assassin. My friend decided he'd hang out for a whole day just to see if anything happened. That would be about a year's worth of movement. Here's the post he made at the end of his experiment.
I loaded in Sedna E, where it all started. It wasn't too bad. I just had to check in now and then to move around and heal to make sure he wasn't dying. But check it out. 24 hours exactly in, and the assassin learned a new trick. He screams! I was reading, and all of a sudden, this crazy loud shriek just about makes me crap myself. It's like something out of a horror movie. I look it up, and there he is, just crouched down, right in front of me. Of course, the second I moved my character, he ran off. When I went back to the portrait room, the door was still locked. Damn it, damn it, damn it!
A bit later, he came to the decision that he needed to wait 3 days. 3 years. The PM advising us to try DOSBox showed up in February of 2008 was his reasoning anyway.
After the first shriek, the assassin stops hitting you out of nowhere. Now, he'll shriek, If you don't move for a few seconds after that, he hits you. I think whoever made the mod was trying to help. At night, I got my headphones on, and I was just kinda dozing off, when he wakes me up with a terrible shriek. I jiggle the mouse, and I'm good.
That post was 2 days in from his laptop. Once it was over...
Fuck. So fucking done. So, I wait 3 days, right, and, after the fucking assassin made me jiggle the mouse, he shrieks again. So, I look, and everyone in town outside, they're all saying, watch the sky. I don't see anything though. When the game starts getting dark, like really dark, I turn the brightness all the way on my computer. I can still barely see. I see other people in the game, little figures running around in the distance, just running back and forth. If I try to get close, they run off. Now, I was trying to sleep. The lights are off, and this is kinda creepy. I don't want to get up and turn on my light. I don't want to miss anything, but nothing fucking happens. Eventually, I go back to the cathedral. It's still dark, and I gotta swim. And the whole time I can see all these guys swimming all around me, just barely there. I make it to the citadel, and there's normal light inside, and I get worried. Sure enough, the portrait door is still fucking closed. I go outside, and it's all starting over. So that's it. I'm fucking going to bed. I'm fucking done. The end.
After that, 2 things happened. First, another of the people who got to the portrait room claimed that the assassin was showing up in his regular Morrowind game. As a quick explanation, if you reinstalled Morrowind to a different folder, you could have normal Morrowind install along with JVK. He himself chalked it up to an overactive imagination at first, but he reported a couple of really big scares with the black figure crawling right at him, or seeing it waiting for him just around a corner before scuttling off. Another one of those people who reached the portrait room started a regular Morrowind game, but never saw him for sure. It was just a couple of maybes late at night, and always at a distance. The second is that my friend started getting really abusive and short-tempered on the board, though he stopped talking about JVK entirely. It got so bad that he was soon kicked off. I didn't hear anything from him for a couple of weeks after that, so I sent him an email. This was a part of his reply.
I know I shouldn't, but with classes out, I've got some time, so I started JVK up again. It's almost 2011, and I think I've got the sleep madness. But stuff is happening. It's still dark. Once it gets dark, it never gets any lighter. It stays like that. The people moved a few months ago. Evelyn said Nanine just went to that little bandit cave and moved in. They killed the bandits inside, and now they're just standing around inside. They don't say anything anymore. They don't do anything when you click on them. I quick saved and killed one, and it just stood there till he died without fighting back. It's like that everywhere. You have to walk since the quick travel people are all in caves now. But all the cities and towns are just deserted. All the people are in caves and tombs. Evelyn Vivek is down in her sewers. I'm going to Ghostgate next. I want to see if Tierras is still there. I'll tell you what he says when I get there.
I replied and said I wanted to see what he said too, and waited a day. When I didn't get a reply, I mailed him again, and a couple of hours later, he sent back.
Sorry, I totally forgot. So it's 2014 now. Since it's always night, the stars are always moving. The whole screen was dark, but you can still see the brightest stars moving around. Tierras was gone. Everyone in Ghostgate was gone. But I don't know where they went. They're not in any of the nearby caves. But there's new stuff. People still don't say anything, but their eyes are bleeding. It's so dark that even with a light spell, you have to get up right against them to see. But there they are, the little dark streaks coming down from their eyes. I think I gotta be getting close. I know this is stupid. There's no way the payoff is going to be worth it. But I just want to be able to say I stuck it out.
I got that one during the day. Later that night, I got a follow-up email.
Some of the planets aren't moving right. It's pissing me off. If this keeps up, I won't be able to keep track anymore. It's almost 2015 now, and I think, fuck. You know, I just noticed there aren't any monsters anymore. I'm completely alone outside now. The main quest people's bodies are still lying around though. I don't need headphones anymore, so I'll just leave them off. When he shrieks, it's like he's screaming right into my ear. I think I even kind of anticipate it. He's around a lot more now, a lot closer. He's different from the other people who started showing up. Remember? They kind of run around just where I can barely see them. I have to admit, it's kinda creepy at night. Sometimes, when I go to the bathroom or whatever, I swear I can see something out of the corner of my eye. I'm keeping all the lights on now.
I sent him a letter, jokingly telling him to get some real sleep, and left it at that. 2 mornings later, I found this in my email. It was the last thing I got for him.
I just got up from a fucked up dream, I think. The assassin shrieked at me, and when I opened my eyes, he was right there, crouching over me. His arms and legs were longer, more like spiders. I tried to push him away. When I touched him, my hands just went inside him, and I couldn't get them loose. Like he was made of tar or something. Then I woke up. I thought he was gone, but when I looked at the monitor, I wasn't where I was. I was in Corpusceum, Gagagra. For once, the light was okay, and I could see him, all bloated on those mechanical spider legs. I sat down at the computer, and he started talking to me. Not in a box, but really talking to me. In Tierra's voice. He knew some things about me. He told me things that I never told anyone. Like, some things I totally forgot about. He told me that almost nobody had made it this far, and that the door would open soon. I just had to hang on a little while longer. He said he'd know when it was time. He said I might be able to be the first one. I was inside. And then I woke up for real. But I was at the computer. I still wasn't where I was. I'm swimming out to the Citadel Island, and I can hear this tapping. It's at my window. It's over on the left, so I'm sending you this, because I left my laptop on my bed. To the right, just a little... like he's knocking his finger against the glass. I might still be dreaming now.
After this, he stopped responding completely. So, I guess that's end of the story. I know there's a few other stories floating around about the mod, but this is the only one I know is true as far as it goes. I deleted my JV copy of the game pretty much right after I gave up, but I'd like to get them on again. If anyone still has a copy of the file, I'd like to see some of this for myself. Max and Ruby, episode 0004. It was just this Christmas that went by, and things were getting busy. I had to start buying presents for the family. I had finished shopping, but I still needed to grab a present for my little cousin. She is not very hard to shop for, since she is 4. She likes things like Peppa Pig and My Little Pony. She really liked, and I say liked for a reason, Max and Ruby. So when I decided to go looking for a present, I figured something like a Max and Ruby DVD would have been perfect, since she liked to watch it on a daily basis. However, Christmas meant that most of the online DVDs were sold out on most places. I even went to go look on eBay as well, but figured I could not trust what condition the DVDs would have been in. I was stuck in a rut for a while, until that package arrived. I was at home, still scrolling for a stupid DVD, until I heard the sound of something being pushed into my letterbox. I caught a hold of it before my dog did and looked at the package. It seemed to be wrapped fairly badly, with what looked like grease marks and stains on it. Naturally, like anyone would, I decided to open the package. Inside was something that I could not explain. It was a Max and Ruby DVD, but I had not seen one like it online. It was like some little kid had drawn on the front cover with a marker. The title was just Max and Ruby, with what looked like a poorly drawn illustration of Max and Ruby on the front. There were no names or anything, but on the back, it had a list of 4 episodes, all with blunt titles. Episode 001, 002, 003, and 0004. I gave the DVD a watch over, and to my surprise, the episodes were all perfect quality and seemed to have no flaws. It was as if it was a real DVD, just with a homemade cover. The only thing I thought was odd was the episode selection screen. The episodes had names, but they were all called Max and Ruby 1, with the numbers being changed as I went down the list. The actual selection screen was just a plain white screen with black text with the episode list and nothing else. After giving it much thought, I decided to change the cover to something a little nicer by printing out a DVD cover that I had found on Google and tracked down the names of the episodes so they were labeled right. I left the episode list screen alone because I figured it was self-explanatory. Christmas went by and things were fine. I gave my little cousin her DVD and she was happy with it all through Christmas, but that was only because she had not watched it yet. On Boxing Day, the family had gone out for a meal and left me to babysit my cousin. I was not too bothered about being left at home. I figured now was a good time to put on that DVD for her. I had put the DVD in and let it play. While I was in the kitchen eating my dinner, from what I could hear, she had watched episodes 1 to 3 so far. I was just about to finish off my noodles when I heard my cousin screaming from the other room. Dropping everything, I had ran into the living room and saw my cousin curled up on the floor screaming. I had looked up at the TV and I felt my heart in my throat. What I caught a glimpse of was one of the most horrifying things I had ever seen. It was what appeared to be a frame of Max and Ruby standing next to each other in complete darkness. But what made it so horrible was their lack of faces. They had lost their noses and mouths, and their eyes were replaced with big black holes. The colors were a disgusting blood red, and there was faint static in the background. The sound was replaced with what sounded like the Max and Ruby theme playing backwards, with the faint sound of static in the mix of it all. It had to be the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen, and it must have been on screen for at least 20 seconds before the screen went black and the DVD turned off, which alone was weird because DVDs don't usually turn off by themselves. I was able to calm my cousin down, telling her it was not real, and she had just had a nightmare as she had fallen asleep in front of the DVD. However, I knew in my mind that it was completely real. My parents had rung me up and told me that they were going to be out all night, so this was going to be the best opportunity to look at this DVD more closely. I did not mention it to them, and as soon as I hung up the phone, I grabbed the DVD and stuck it in my laptop. As soon as it loaded, I noticed that episode 0004 had now been replaced with R.I.P. Mommy and Daddy, which sent a deep chill down my back. Since my cousin was now asleep, I plugged in my earbuds so she can sleep without having to hear anything. Normally, an episode of Max and Ruby would have 3 short stories, but this episode only had 1. It started off quite lighthearted. Max and Ruby were playing tag in the garden, and their parents were on the porch watching them play. However, something was off. The sound was playing in reverse, and the parents' faces were that of sadness. It panned to the mother and father, and in a voice of deep sorrow, the father spoke.
It's such a shame,
he sighed. It then cut to the short sound of static and a loud scream, followed by the sound of 2 people choking. The sounds felt so real, it made me almost physically sick. The scene then switched to Max and Ruby, standing in front of what looked like a gravestone labeled R.I.P. Mommy and Daddy. The 2 of them had no faces. At this point, there was also no sound apart from faint static. This scene remained on screen for about 1.5 minutes before it cut away to black. It then changed scene again, now showing Max and Ruby sitting in Ruby's room. Both of them were sobbing. The sobs were so realistic and heart-wrenching that it sounded like it was actually taken from a real person mourning. What happened next was probably the most disgusting yet saddest thing I had ever witnessed. The scene had changed to Max sitting in his room. He was standing on a chair with a noose hanging from the ceiling. He had brought it around his neck. The scene faded to black and the static got louder. Almost instantly, it then cut to Ruby walking in on her brother. She let out a gut-twisting scream. The camera was panned on her face as the sound of a chair being kicked and the same choking from before began to play. The picture of Ruby's face stayed on screen for a good 5 minutes. This time, her eyes had returned as the same gaping holes. Ruby then started crying, and as before, there were no other facial features. The static slowly grew louder and drowned out the sound of her cries. The scene cut to black with the loud static. When the screen returned, Ruby was standing, now on her own, in the garden by 2 gravestones. One was labeled R.I.P. Mommy and Daddy, and the other R.I.P. Brother. She then started to look at the camera with glowing blue pupils to speak to me.
Well, Whoever's watching this is because you never watched any of me and my brother's episodes. So, one of these days, you will regret this.
The screen, it faded to black afterwards. At this point, I had already been sick and was sitting all shaken. The episode seemed to have finally come to an end as the Max and Ruby theme played slowly in reverse. I was about to eject the DVD when the same image came up like it did on the TV. This time, however, there was text above the two rabbits that said,
Death is our only release.
There were no credits or anything else. It stayed on like this for a few seconds before the DVD finally popped out of my laptop. I sat there trying to contemplate what had happened. In my shock and fear, I made the stupid decision to break the DVD up as much as I could before leaving the house and shove the pieces down the drain. Thankfully, I kept a few screenshots and saved them to my laptop. The next couple of days went past without anything unusual happening. I did have a few nightmares about the DVD, but luckily, that was all. My cousin had gone back home with the rest of her family. It was another late night, and my parents had gone out for dinner, leaving me to watch TV. I heard what sounded like someone shoving something through the door. At this point, the DVD had left my mind space since I hadn't told anyone about it. However, it all came flooding back to me when I looked down to the doormat and saw a letter in front of me. It was just messily folded up and simply read, Death is our only release. Pokemon Strangled Red. There are tons of stories out there about hacked Pokemon games. Some of them really quite neat, such as the one about a version where you get a ghost as a starter. Some are completely ridiculous. Silly stories about individuals dying after playing a game, or the game talking to them. Don't these writers know less is more when it comes to these stories? Nah, well, I digress. I grew interested in these hacked games that are apparently in any thrift store, on eBay, or handed out by homeless people to random passers-by. I didn't have the pleasure of meeting these creepy people. I merely found this particular cartridge in a trash bin when the garbage truck backed into my neighbor's dumpster. I noticed the game and asked the trash man if I could take it, and he didn't seem to mind. It was thrown away after all. I, of course, checked with my neighbor to confirm that they actually didn't want it, though they seemed perplexed, as if they'd never seen it before in their life. Their son made a grab for it, a little boy who saw the Charizard on the cover, crying out, "Pokemon! I want Mommy!" But his mother told him no, seeing as I found it. He didn't even have a Game Boy anyway. He just liked Pokemon. Thinking nothing more, I simply went home, looking at the cartridge's sticker on the way. Just a plain old red version, the sticker torn slightly across the Charizard's neck, but that was expected with such an old game. I had blue version as a kid, so I was a bit eager to see the, albeit minimal, differences Red had. I was rather disappointed by what I saw when the title screen showed up. Pokemon strangled red version. Well, damn it. It was a hack. Hacks were neat and all, but they had zero monetary value. The original's quite valuable by now. And I wanted to play red anyway, not this crap. Oh well, it was free, so might as well try it. The name was odd, however. Strangled red? That made no sense. Not even in a morbid description of someone being asphyxiated, as people turn blue when choking, not red. Who knows? Maybe there was a pair of these hacks, and I just so happened to get the red one. The more I thought about this, though, the more interested I became. My initial disappointment turned into curiosity. I wanted to know what the creator had made, and I was going to note everything I saw. The first oddity I noticed was the start screen had a Charizard next to the trainer instead of a Charmander. Also, the Pokemon never cycled through like the original versions did. It just stayed Charizard, even after 5 minutes of waiting. Shrugging, I hit start, noticing there was no Charizard cry as I did, like there was supposed to be. I saw there was a continue option, so I figured I'd do what everyone else does when they get used games and see what the previous owner had done.
No.
I blinked in surprise. No? What do you mean, no? The game wouldn't let me continue, no matter what. Though, on the fourth attempt, I heard the Charizard cry. Quiet and barely audible, but there. Shrugging it off, I decided to just hit new game like I would have done after checking the old file anyway. The screen cut to black for a while. No Professor Oak, no starting theme, just nothing at all. Eventually, the screen came back, showing a bedroom, 2 beds, 2 TVs, and a computer in the corner. My trainer sprite was the usual one, consistent with the original red version. I was curious as to why it didn't ask my name, though that was answered as I opened the pause menu, noticing my trainer was named Steven. No, this is not my real name or some stupid crap like that. This game isn't self-aware or haunted. Well, at least that I know of. It just had a name chosen already. Curious, I saw that he had the starter amount of money. No badges. He didn't look like Red though. His hair was much longer, almost reaching halfway down his back. Red's usual smile replaced with a confident smirk. Honestly, I found this sprite much cooler than Red. Next, I checked out his Pokemon. A single Charmander, level 5, named Mickey. Nothing was odd about it, or should I say her, with the name and all. She had beginning Charmander stats, only knew Scratch and Tail Whip, the basic stuff. Really, the game seemed relatively normal. Returning to the game, I walked about the room, noticing Steven's long hair was present on the back of my trainer sprite when my back was turned to the camera. I didn't recognize the house, but I descended the stairs to see more. Downstairs was another trainer who spoke to me the instant I came down. Mike. Ready yet? Steven.
Yeah.
I assumed this Mike was my rival, pre-decided for me, a replacement of Blue most likely. Though I thought back to the bedroom having 2 beds, realizing they weren't just rivals. They were brothers. They talked back and forth, basic Pokemon dialogue, becoming a Pokemaster, catch 'em all, stuff like that, before having a little argument over which is better, Charmander or Squirtle, which of course led to the introduction battle, like the one versus Blue in the lab. Simple enough, scratch, tackle, till I won purely for the fact of having the first turn. I took note of how much better Steven's sprite looked in combat than Red's. A different pose, his hair looking like it was blowing in the wind. A brief, minor upgrade, but still, much nicer. I left the house after some more banter with my brother, stepping out to the Pallet Town theme. Going to the east, I found this was indeed Pallet Town. The house was simply on the outskirts to the west. I noted there was no mysterious grassy field like in normal Pallet Town. Wandering about, I decided to check in on Red's home. His mother was inside, and when I talked to her, she commented on how handsome Steven looked, hoping her son would look up to him as a role model for when he became a trainer himself the next year. Which of course led me to realize this game took place a year before the original Pokemon. Red was even upstairs, playing the SNES in his room, commenting,
"I'm going to be the very best too when it's my turn."
I was starting to like this hack. It was interesting. A completely new adventure. A different character. Hell, Steven even seemed to have a history with the people in his town. A reputation. A personality beyond a silent protagonist. The people in town talked to him as a person, making conversation, and not just spouting tutorial crap. Even Blue's sister had a new dialogue. They seemed to be in a relationship too, as the dialogue ended with a kiss and a heart over her head. Professor Oak simply wished me well, giving me a Pokédex to aid my adventure. He wasn't giving it to me to be the reason behind the adventure like every other Pokemon game out there. He gave it to me out of kindness, something to help me on my way, a gift. I was liking this more and more with each second. The game seemed to have an actual story now. I was somebody, not just a cookie-cutter protagonist anyone could be, not some blank sheet that could be replaced without notice. The story was different, though the actual gameplay remained unchanged. I went north like I was supposed to, went from town to town, collecting badges, received the praise of the leaders. Steven's fame even seemed to spread, as some NPCs would talk like they knew him. I used Mickey for every battle, and she was growing surprisingly fast. She handled Brock with ease, even pounded Misty with no trouble at all. She wasn't as adversely affected by super effective attacks as others, did more damage than a regular Charmander. She was a veritable powerhouse. She even became a Charizard at the mere level of 25. Not bad at all, I must say. Things started to get weird though, as soon as I reached Lavender Town. Okay, yeah, I know. Lavender Town is the focus behind every creepy story and the like, but it was the only place that was noticeably different. There was no Team Rocket invasion, which I found odd, though I did remember this was a year in the past, so the invasion wouldn't occur until Red's time. I tried to enter Pokemon Tower, aiming to get a Ghastly, but that's when it got odd. Steven.
I have no reason to be here.
Steven wouldn't go into Pokemon Tower, no matter what I did. This was weird. I mean, hell, there are a million places in Kanto you really have no need to be. Little random houses with nothing but children NPCs, for example. Why was it here that Steven wouldn't enter? With a shrug, I figured I wouldn't need a Ghastly, seeing as Mickey could handle anything. So I simply went on my way. Lavender Town serving no purpose other than a passageway with a Pokécenter. The game progressed normally from there. The remaining gyms fell, and eventually I made my way to the Elite Four and defeated them. As with Blue, my brother, Mike was there before me, initiating the championship battle, which Mickey swept with ease. The aftermath of the battle was quite pleasant. None of the tension that was present between Red and Blue at the end of their match. The brothers congratulated each other on their progress and shook hands before the screen went white. No Hall of Fame, nor any credits. When the screen came back, it was at the house again. The two brothers sitting at the computer, conversing with each other. Steven.
I don't want to.
Mike. Come on. I just gotta borrow her for a second to finish the Pokédex. The entry won't register unless she recognizes me as a master for just a second.
Steven.
But she's my Mickey.
Mike.
I promise I'll give her back. Come on, please?
Yes. No.
I was a bit perplexed, so I hit no to be cautious. Mike.
Come on, please?
No.
Come on, please?
I realized this would simply continue to loop until I hit yes. So I did, just to see what would happen. Mike.
Alright, this will just take a sec. Then we'll both be Poké Masters.
Steven. ... The screen changed to the animation shown when two people trade Pokemon, which I found a bit weird, seeing as I was solo. But whatever, this was what apparently was supposed to happen. Mickey went first. I watched lazily as she began to travel down the trading tube. Snap! That made me jump. The sudden noise resonating in my silent bedroom, loud due to the volume being way up. Looking at the screen, I noticed the game had seemed to freeze. Mickey still in mid-trade, but the game wasn't doing anything. With a sigh, I just turned off the game, wondering when my last save was. When the game turned back on, I stared for a moment at the start screen. There was no Charizard next to the trainer. Upon pressing start, I saw the new game option was absent, leaving only continue. This was strange, to say the least, so I selected it. The game starting without even showing my stats as usual. My jaw dropped at what I was greeted with.
1 year later.
The Lavender Town theme came first, playing its normal way, the screen slowly fading in from blackness. Steven was in the Pokemon Tower, which made the music even stranger, seeing as the tower had its own theme. He was standing in front of a tombstone, not doing anything. Wondering what was going on, I pressed A. Steven. ... Confused, I tried walking, realizing I was indeed in control at the moment. I brought up the pause menu and checked my party. Mickey was gone. Not just Mickey, all Pokemon. He had nothing. The Pokédex was absent from the menu. His bag was empty. Honestly concerned now, I checked his trainer card. He had no money. He had no badges. His playtime was 8,795 hours, which was impossible as I had only logged 30 in before. But that wasn't the strangest part. The picture of the handsome, confident young trainer was different. His eyes were blank, His face turned slightly down. That smirk of his was gone, replaced by a lack of any expression at all. That long hair of his, before in a perfect perm, was now messy and unkempt. I couldn't look at him anymore. Closing the menu, I went to move out of the tower, but with every step I took away from the tombstone, the screen flickered like it did when a Pokemon was poisoned. Gulping, I brought up the trainer card once again. His picture was getting worse. Every step I took, he hung his head more and more. His shoulders slumped. He bent over. By the time I had exited the tower, he was on his knees, hands to his face, hair draped across him. I had guessed already what was going on, but this clinched it. I began to put some things together in my mind. I had always wondered why there was no champion in the original games besides your rival. Why is it you, the protagonist, had to beat your rival when he just waltzed in, no previous champion to challenge? Then it struck me. The answer was right here. The previous champion gave up. His precious Mickey was apparently dead, and with her, so died part of him. His Pokédex, the other Pokemon, his badges, his fame, all of it. He threw it away. In that year, the year that I missed, the year where all those hours came from, I even did the math. There is 8,765 hours in a year. Add that to my 30 from before, and it matched up. Even so, the game kept going. This should have been an ending, I thought. I mean, what else was there to do? I had no Pokédex, no Pokemon, not anything. What was I supposed to be doing? I talked to everyone in the town, but they all said similar things.
Are you okay? Still mourning, I see. Everything will be all right. Please, is there anything we can do?
Stephen never replied to them, and they all simply said the same things over and over. I couldn't put the game down now. This was all so strange. Curious, I headed off into the tall grass and eventually got into a battle with a Rattata. No Pokemon was sent out, just Stephen's sprite. I was wondering how I'd battle.
Wild Rattata left you be.
The battle ended without anything happening. This was certainly interesting, and it happened with every Pokemon I encountered.
Wild Pidgey ignored you. Wild Ponyta wandered off.
The music never changed either. No matter where I went, Lavender Town came from the speakers, following me. Sometimes slowed down slightly, sometimes not. I searched everywhere, every town, talked to everybody, wondering just what the hell I needed to do. My frustration was mixing with the depressing atmosphere of all of this, making the experience altogether unnerving and uncomfortable. But I couldn't tear myself away. I was starting to get a bit angry though. Nobody telling me anything besides giving me their condolences and trying to give me items like lemonade or coffee. Each met with,
No.
I slapped myself for idiocy. How the likely answer was right in front of me. Pallet Town, of course. When I went there though, which took a long time, having to walk with no Pokemon to fly with, nor a bicycle to ride, and Steven only seemed to move half the regular movement speed. It wasn't much different. I first tried talking to Professor Oak.
These things happen. You were just unlucky.
Next, I tried Blue's sister.
Please, don't leave home again.
Red's mom wouldn't even talk to me at all. With nowhere else in mind to go, I walked to the west, finding the house from the beginning, which I had never entered since leaving Pallet Town. Inside was Mike, but talking to him was just as useless.
I'm so sorry.
I pondered for a moment if this really was the ending. Steven, doomed to do nothing but roam Kanto in misery, haunted by the memories, forced to listen to everyone's concerns about him. As a last-ditch effort to do anything, I went to the bedroom and walked over to the bed. Steven.
I'm going to sleep.
The screen faded to black for a moment, but then slowly faded back in, the world having a black tint to it. Mike's sprite laying in the other bed. I assumed this meant it was night. Steven.
I'm going to do it.
Do what? Again, I had no idea. I tried inspecting everything in the room, but nothing happened. As soon as I left the house, another dialogue.
It can bring her back. It can do anything.
What in the hell was it? Something that could do anything. I couldn't for the life of me figure it out. Wandering about, I tried to leave Pallet Town the usual way.
Not that way.
He wouldn't go any further. I tried the homes.
Screw them.
I quirked my eyebrow at that, forgetting for a moment that this was not a real Pokemon game. The vulgarity just took me off guard. I continued to look around, but there was nowhere I could go, until I accidentally stepped in the ocean, and Steven walked right in, only the upper half of his sprite visible, like the swimmers you encounter in the Cerulean Gym. I didn't know he could swim.
The missing one.
Missing one? I paused for a moment. No, he couldn't possibly mean that. I hadn't tried the missing note trick on this hack yet, but it just fit too well. That had to be what he meant. I surfed all the way towards Cinnabar. I began to feel something was off, more so than this already was. Silence. The Lavender Town theme had stopped. There was no noise at all, nor were there any Pokemon. I just kept going, finding Cinnabar and surfing up and down the east coast. Lo and behold,
Wild Missing-No appeared.
Steven.
Mine. Wild Missing-No was caught.
What the hell? Steven didn't do anything. He just commanded that atrocity of broken data to join him. No, become his possession. And it did. I was getting more and more disturbed by this all. Checking the start menu, I saw Missing-No was not in my party, but instead, an item, making things even stranger. I checked the trainer card as well. Steven had his back to me, his long hair draped behind him, his hands in his pockets. Nothing else. Remembering what he said at the start of this night, I realized what I had to do. I surfed to land and made my way northeast to where else? Lavender Town. Along the way, I noticed all the trainers, oddly still out at this hour, wouldn't look at Steven, all of them turning when he passed, even those that were normally static. I tried talking to one of the officers in the guardhouse buildings. Just go. They all said the same thing. The one sent chills down my spine.
Sometimes, dead is best.
My hands were sweating by this point. Steven was about to try the impossible. Something some would see as a crime against nature, which many of these people shared that opinion. I steeled myself. It's just a game, and I was going to complete it. It took an entirety to reach Pokemon Tower, but I got there eventually. Taking a deep breath and heading towards the tombstone, I remembered which one. The image of Steven standing before it was burned into my mind after all. First, I tried inspecting it. Steven.
Nikki.
Nothing happened. With a gulp, I opened the menu and selected Missing No from the bag. Oak.
Steven! Don't use it!
I was reminded of when Professor Oak would magically tell you when you couldn't use a key item somewhere, like when using a bicycle in a building. Though, the message this time was different, and even worse. Steven responded to it.
In a world that cheated me, why should I play fair? Steven used it. Steven obtained mine.
What in God's name did I obtain? I couldn't tell you, because the game took away my control. Without my input, Steven began to leave the tower on his own, walking single step by single step. The Lavender Town theme started again as he left the tower and began his excruciatingly slow journey against my will. Every time he crossed one of the borders where the music would change, it got progressively slower, more and more disturbing. By the time he reached Cerulean City, it was a demonic rumbling. I just stared, watching him, trying to guess where he was going. But it was getting more and more obvious. He was heading to Pallet Town. The music had all but stopped when he got there, playing single note by single note. He went exactly where I had guessed, right to his own house, inside and up the stairs. At this point, there was no music. Steven just moved step by step, stopping at his brother's bed, turning to face him. At first, I thought the game had froze. He didn't do anything, simply stood there, and I couldn't move him. I did, however, find out I could open the pause menu. I was terrified to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I selected his trainer card. There was a low growl noise, like a distorted Pokemon cry. Steven was looking at me again, directly at the screen. He was hunched over, his bangs obscuring his face. His hair was wild and feathered out. Between his bangs, there wasn't even a face at all, just black. 2 red eyes looking straight forward, a white grin contrasting with the darkness. That wasn't all. His name was now S! 3v3n. I couldn't look away, my eyes glued to his, not breaking contact for some time. My vision was getting blurry until I couldn't see very well. My face grew wet. I was crying like a baby. There was nothing I could do but try and hold back the tears. I was with this boy from the start. I built him up to greatness and was then forced to watch his decline after a tragic accident. And now, he was this thing, this abomination. I watched him go insane. Halting my tears, wiping my eyes, I closed out of the trainer card and tried to save the game, wanting to just quit. The game informed me that this was impossible.
Nothing can be saved now.
The pause menu wouldn't close no matter what I did, so with no other option, I checked the bag. Nothing happened. I checked Pokemon, and there was one. A single sprite met me. It had 0 HP. Its status, dead. Its name, I selected it, and I was greeted with 4 options. Status.
It's her.
Switch.
Never.
Close.
No.
Strangle. My fingers shaking. I selected Strangle, and the menu closed, showing Steven in the room again. Steven.
Goodbye.
Snap! The game shut itself off. I was more dumbfounded than frightened. In a bit of shock, I turned it back on. The title screen showing the maniac Steven and a horribly glitched Charizard. I pressed start, then continue. All I saw was a zoomed out view of Pallet Town, showing Steven's home to the west, tall grass surrounding it, those unmovable stones blocking it from the rest of the town. The image was completely static. No music, no movement, before fading to white and going back to the title screen. It was as it had been when I first popped it in. A trainer and a Charizard. I attempted to hit continue.
No.